The streets of downtown Chicago bustled with life, but for young Jimmy, it was a battleground. At just 12 years old, Jimmy had taken on responsibilities no child his age should ever have to. He wasn't interested in playing games with friends or enjoying carefree days. Instead, he spent his time washing cars under the blazing sun, trying to scrape together a few dollars. His clothes were always the same: faded jeans, a worn-out t-shirt, and shoes with holes in them. His light brown hair, always slightly disheveled, hinted at a boy who had more important things to worry about than his appearance. Jimmy's mother, Linda, had fallen gravely ill, and the medical bills were stacking up. The medication she needed was expensive, far beyond what Jimmy could earn in a day. But he wasn't one to give up easily. His mother had always told him that where there's a will, there's a way. She was his rock, even in her weakened state, and he was determined to be hers. Each morning, Jimmy set out to the busy intersections, offering to wash cars for anyone who would give him the chance. His hands, raw and blistered from the soapy water, never slowed down. Every car he cleaned brought him one step closer to affording the medicine that might save his mother's life. People passed by, some noticing the boy, but most not. To them, he was just another street kid trying to make a few bucks. But behind his small frame and soft blue eyes lay a story of love, sacrifice, and desperation that would touch even the coldest hearts if they took the time to hear it. One chilly autumn day, a shiny black sedan pulled up to the curb where Jimmy was standing. The driver was a middle-aged man, dressed in a sleek suit, clearly wealthy. He rolled down the window and looked at the boy with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Hey, kid," the man called out. "How much to wash my car?" Jimmy looked up, brushing the hair out of his eyes. $5, sir. I can do it real quick." The man raised an eyebrow, glancing at his spotless car. It didn't really need a wash, but something about Jimmy's determination caught his attention. He nodded, pulling out a crisp $20 bill. "Go ahead, kid. Do your best." Jimmy's eyes widened at the sight of the $20 bill. It was more than he usually made in a whole day, and the thought of being that much closer to affording his mother's medicine filled him with hope. He got to work, scrubbing every inch of the car with care, even though it was already immaculate. The man watched him closely, intrigued by the boy's dedication. "What's your name, kid?" "Jimmy," he replied, focusing on the tires. "Just trying to earn some money, sir." "For what? Toys? Clothes?" Jimmy shook his head. "For my mum. She's sick. I need to buy her medicine." The man's expression softened. "Where's your dad?" Jimmy paused, wiping his hands on his shirt. "Don't have one, sir. It's just me and her." The man was silent for a moment, watching the boy work harder than he'd seen anyone work for such a small reward. There was something about Jimmy's quiet strength that reminded him of someone he hadn't thought about in years. As Jimmy finished, he handed back the $20 bill. "I don't need all this, sir. Just $5 is fine." The man was taken aback by the boy's honesty. He smiled, pushing the bill back into Jimmy's hand. "Keep it. You've earned it. But tell me, what kind of medicine does your mother need?" Jimmy hesitated, his voice trembling. "It's expensive, sir. She has something wrong with her heart, and the doctor says without the medicine she might—" His voice trailed off, unwilling to say the words aloud. The man felt a pang of sadness and something else, a deep-seated sense of guilt he couldn't explain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another $20. "Here, take this too. Maybe it'll help." Jimmy's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." As the man drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about Jimmy's story, but he couldn't quite place it. Who was this boy's mother? Why did his words stir memories he had buried long ago? As the sun began to set, Jimmy walked home with a heavy heart, but a little more hope than he'd had that morning. He clutched the money in his hand, knowing it was still far from enough, but it was a start. Back at home, in their tiny, run-down apartment, his mother lay on the couch, her face pale and thin, struggling to breathe. Jimmy sat beside her, holding her hand, feeling the weight of the world on his young shoulders. He had to find a way to save her, and time was running out. Meanwhile, the wealthy man, now back in his luxurious office, couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Something about his story gnawed at him, pulling at his conscience. He decided he had to find out more about Jimmy's mother. There was a mystery here, and he was determined to uncover it. Little did he know, the answers he sought would shake him to his core. The days after Jimmy's encounter with the wealthy man seemed to blend together in a blur of exhaustion and worry. Each morning, he returned to the busy intersections, scrubbing cars until his hands ached. Every dollar he earned brought him closer to the medicine his mother desperately needed. But as time dragged on, he began to feel the weight of an impossible deadline pressing down on him. Meanwhile, in a world far removed from Jimmy's daily struggles, the man who had given him the money couldn't shake the encounter. His name was Charles Hamilton, a successful businessman who had built his fortune through hard work and determination. He had seen poverty before, but there was something about Jimmy's story that lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the boy's situation, it was the haunting familiarity of his words. Late one evening, sitting in his lavish office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sparkling Chicago skyline, Charles found himself pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of the nagging feeling that had been with him ever since meeting Jimmy. "Who is that boy's mother?" he muttered to himself, his mind racing. Why does his story sound so familiar? Charles pulled out his phone and dialed a number. On the other end, his assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Grace, answered. "Mr. Hamilton, what can I do for you?" "Grace," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "I need you to do something for me. There's a boy I met a few days ago, name's Jimmy. He washes cars near the business district. I need you to find out who he is, where he lives, and more importantly, who his mother is. There's something important I need to know." Grace, used to her boss's unusual requests, didn't question it. "Consider it done, Mr. Hamilton. I'll have the information by tomorrow." As Charles hung up the phone, he couldn't help but feel a rising sense of dread. It was as though he was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer. Back in his tiny apartment, Jimmy sat beside his mother, gently holding her frail hand. Linda had once been vibrant and full of life, but now she was a shadow of the woman she had been. Her once bright eyes had dulled, and every breath she took seemed like a struggle. Jimmy's heart ached with the fear of losing her. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Linda asked in a weak voice, her lips curling into a small smile despite the pain she was in. "I made some more money, Mom," Jimmy said, trying to sound hopeful. "I'm getting closer to buying the medicine. Soon you'll be better." Linda's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. She knew the truth, even if Jimmy didn't want to face it. The money he was earning wasn't enough, but she didn't have the heart to crush his hope. "I'm so proud of you, Jimmy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're so strong. But remember, no matter what happens, I love you more than anything in this world." Jimmy swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "I love you too, Mom, and I'm not giving up. I'll find a way to help you." As Linda drifted off to sleep, Jimmy sat in the dim light of their apartment, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could raise more money. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, Grace walked into Charles's office with a file in her hand, her face pale and tight with emotion. Charles, who had been anxiously waiting for news, looked up immediately, sensing something was wrong. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice tense. Grace hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Hamilton, I found out who the boy's mother is. Her name is Linda Carter." Charles felt a jolt of recognition, his heart skipping a beat. "Linda Carter?" he repeated, as if trying to make sure he had heard correctly. "Yes, sir," Grace continued, her voice softening. "And it seems that you two have a history. She used to work for you many years ago, in your early days, before you became the CEO." Charles sank into his chair, his mind reeling. Memories he had long buried came rushing back. Linda, the bright, ambitious woman who had worked in his office all those years ago. They had shared something, a connection, a bond. But life had taken them in different directions. He had gone on to build an empire, while Linda had faded from his memory. "I didn't know," Charles whispered, his voice full of regret. "I didn't know she had a son." Grace nodded solemnly. "Mr. Hamilton, from what I've gathered, Linda's been struggling for a long time. She's been sick, and Jimmy, he's been trying to take care of her on his own." Charles felt a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. How had he let this happen? How had he lost touch with someone who had once meant so much to him? He remembered Linda as a kind, generous woman, full of life and promise. How had she ended up here, sick and alone, with a son who was barely surviving? Without another word, Charles stood up and grabbed his coat. "I need to see her," he said, his voice firm. "I need to see Linda and Jimmy." Later that afternoon, Charles arrived at the rundown apartment building where Jimmy and his mother lived. The contrast between the luxury of his own life and the poverty he saw here hit him hard. As he climbed the creaky stairs, he felt an overwhelming sense of shame. How had he allowed someone he once cared for to end up like this? He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Jimmy, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes tired and wary. "Can I help you, sir?" Jimmy asked politely, not recognizing the man who had given him the money just days before. Charles cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Jimmy, I'm here to see your mother." Jimmy frowned, unsure of what to make of the stranger at his door. "Do you know my mom?" Charles nodded slowly. "Yes, Jimmy. I knew her a long time ago. We were friends." Jimmy hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing Charles to enter. The apartment was small and cluttered, with worn furniture and the smell of illness lingering in the air. As Charles stepped inside, his eyes fell on Linda, lying weakly on the couch, her face pale and gaunt. His heart broke at the sight of her. "Linda," he whispered, stepping closer. Linda's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw Charles, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but then it was replaced by shock and confusion. "Charles, is that really you? Is that..." For a few moments, time seemed to stand still. Charles could barely breathe as he stood in front of Linda, his mind racing with memories of the past, the laughter they shared, the late nights working together, the dreams they both had. But the woman in front of him now was a shell of the vibrant person he had once known. It was as though life had stolen her spirit, piece by piece. "Yes, Linda," Charles said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "It's me. I can't believe I found you like this." Linda blinked back tears, her frail hand trembling as she reached out to him. "I never thought I'd see you again, Charles. Life, it didn't turn out the way we planned, did it? Charles knelt down beside her, taking her hand in his. No, it didn't. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you reach out? I could have helped you, Linda. I could have helped Jimmy. Linda shook her head slowly, her voice weak but resolute. I couldn't, Charles. I didn't want to be a burden. You had your life, your success. I didn't want to drag you into my problems. I made my choices, and I had to live with them. Charles felt a deep ache in his chest. But you didn't have to do this alone. You've been through so much. Jimmy has been through so much. At the mention of Jimmy's name, Linda's eyes softened with pride. He's a good boy, Charles. He's been my strength through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without him. Jimmy, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward, his eyes wide with confusion and curiosity. Mum, how do you know him? He asked, looking between Charles and his mother. Linda smiled weakly, her gaze shifting to her son. Jimmy, Charles and I, we were friends a long time ago. We worked together before you were born. He's a good man. Charles stood up and turned to Jimmy, emotion thick in his throat. Your mother is an incredible woman, Jimmy. She helped me more than she'll ever know, and now I want to help both of you. Jimmy looked up at Charles, his brow furrowed. But how? We don't need charity, sir. I can take care of my mom. I'm saving up for her medicine. Charles knelt down to Jimmy's level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've been incredibly brave, Jimmy. But this isn't charity. This is me repaying a debt I owe your mother for everything she did for me when I was just starting out. I wouldn't be where I am today without her. Linda's eyes filled with tears, a mix of pride and relief washing over her. Charles, you don't owe me anything. Charles shook his head firmly. That's where you're wrong, Linda. I owe you more than I can ever repay, and I'm going to make sure you get the care you need, both of you. Before Jimmy or Linda could protest, Charles continued, I'll cover all of the medical expenses. I'll make sure you have the best doctors, the best treatment. You're not fighting this alone anymore. Linda's tears began to flow freely now, and Jimmy, standing beside his mother, felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had spent so long trying to be the adult, trying to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't have to do it alone. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton, Jimmy whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for helping my mom. Charles smiled warmly at the boy, then turned back to Linda. I'll make all the arrangements. Starting today, you're going to get better, Linda, I promise. In the weeks that followed, Charles kept his word. He arranged for Linda to receive the best medical care money could buy. Specialists were flown in, medications were provided, and slowly, bit by bit, Linda's health began to improve. The color returned to her cheeks, and the strength came back to her voice. Jimmy, once burdened by the weight of his mother's illness, was finally able to focus on being a kid again. But Charles's help didn't stop there. He found a way to bring Jimmy and Linda into his life, not as charity cases, but as family. He made sure they had a safe and comfortable place to live, and he even offered Jimmy a part-time job at one of his offices, knowing how much the boy valued hard work. One crisp winter evening, Charles visited their new apartment, which was a world away from the rundown place they had once called home. As he sat down with Linda and Jimmy over dinner, he couldn't help but feel that he had found something far more valuable than wealth or success. He had found a family he didn't even know he was missing. Charles, Linda said softly, looking at him with gratitude in her eyes, you've given us a second chance at life. I don't know how we can ever repay you. Charles shook his head, smiling. You already have, Linda, in more ways than you'll ever know. As the evening went on, Laughter filled the room, a sound that had been absent from Linda and Jimmy's lives for far too long. And in that moment, surrounded by the people he had come to care for deeply, Charles knew that his life had changed just as much as theirs. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in money or success, but in the love and connections we build with those around us. As the story of Jimmy, Linda, and Charles unfolded, their lives were forever intertwined by a single act of kindness. What started as a simple car wash turned into a journey of hope, redemption, and the power of second chances. And as they faced the future together, they knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would never face them alone. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Hope for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next story.